So we'll continue with the discussion of marriage systems, focusing in this lecture on marriage types, with the terms monogamy and polygamy as the guiding frames for this discussion. So monogamy is one spouse at a time, polygamy is multiple spouses at one time. These are generally considered rules that govern the number of spouses that you can have. So those terms refer to those rules in a marriage system that allow legal marriage spouses. So you're familiar with monogamy from the United States, for instance, where we are legally allowed to have one spouse at a time, and in order to change spouses or to add a new spouse, we need to divorce the first spouse. So monogamy is one spouse at a time. Polygamy is multiple spouses at one time, and this is an important distinction in words here. Polygamy, with G-A-M-Y as it shows in the slide, is a generic multiple spouses. That could be multiple wives or multiple husbands. The next slide will talk a little bit about specifics of polygamy. So types of polygamy include polygyny, man marrying multiple wives, or polyandry, a woman marrying multiple husbands. That's usually fraternal polyandry, a woman marrying brothers, or serial polygamy, which is common in the US. And I'll talk about all of those separately, but let's start with polygyny, man marrying multiple wives. In addition to becoming familiar with this from the Gwembe-Tonga case, where you're encountering multiple instances of men marrying multiple wives, you might have been familiar with this idea from another biblical reference. In the biblical times, husbands could have more than one wife, a practice known as polygyny, and this is permitted in a majority of societies around the world, actually. So in the case of Jacob, from the biblical context, a man can marry several sisters. And contrary to that idea, there are many societies, such as an ethnic group in Nigeria known as the Kanuri, who forbid polygyny between sisters. And the Kanuri justify this idea, justify this rule as helping to maintain good relationships among the sisters and within a family. So, according to the Kanuri logic, if a man married sisters, multiple sisters, he would undermine the relationship between those sisters and the idea of the co-wives. He would undermine the relationship of the co-wives as well. And among the Gwembe-Tonga, there is clan exogamy. So I talked in the last lecture about marrying outside of the group. So clans in the Gwembe must marry outside of each other. So a man cannot marry a woman from his own clan. Additionally, in the context of polygyny, a man cannot marry multiple wives from one clan. He can marry multiple wives, but each wife must be from a different clan. And again, the idea there is to build alliances between the different clans and to avoid the conflict that might emerge when women come from the same family group. So like the Kanuri in Nigeria, the idea that you might undermine the functioning of the family if you married women who were too closely related. So these examples just show that no matter what rules a society has, members of the culture will generally offer a pretty rational explanation for the rule. In the case of other marriage systems, there's equally rational rules offered by local explanations. So I just want to emphasize again that if you look at the words on the slide here, polygamy is the general term with a P-O-L-Y-G-A-M-Y. That's the general term, multiple spouses of either sex. Polygyny, P-O-L-Y-G-Y-N-Y, is a man marrying multiple spouses, multiple wives. So it's important to remember the difference between those two words. Another form of marriage, specifically another form of polygamy, is known as polyandry, in which a woman marries multiple husbands. And usually when a woman marries multiple husbands, it's brothers that she's marrying. And this is a very, very rare form of marriage around the world. But it's usually found in cultures that have a lot of land pressure. So for instance, in one region of South India, where land is extremely scarce and the inheritance of land is very restricted, a woman marrying multiple brothers allows land to stay within the family and not have to be divided between the brothers. So if a nuclear family is created with multiple brothers and one wife, then the land of that family remains in multiple hands of the brothers instead of separated. Also in Nepal, there's another instance of polyandry. And then finally, serial polygamy. Notice there that that's polygamy, multiple spouses, is very common in the U.S. The high divorce rate in the U.S. and the remarriage rate is a form of serial polygamy, meaning multiple spouses over time, but they occur only one at a time. So in the U.S., we practice monogamy, where it's a lifetime single spouse marriage, or increasingly we have serial polygamy. And this is, kind of a new way of looking at American society, because the norm is monogamy, but in fact, when we look at the rate of divorce and the rate of remarriage, we see that, in fact, polygamy exists, but it's a different form of polygamy. And, Elizabeth Taylor, what is she on her 7th or 8th husband at this point? That's an extreme example of what we're talking about when we say serial polygamy. And of course, this is actually something also practiced in many societies around the world, including societies in Africa and including the Gwembe Tonga. So men practice polygyny, so multiple wives at one time, but then also there is divorce and is remarriage, and women, in fact, will marry again after they divorce. So while Gwembe women cannot be married to more than one man at a time, they can marry multiple husbands over time as long as they have divorced or been widowed. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about this part of marriage systems called postmarital residence, and you do not need to memorize all of these terms. I will emphasize a few of these terms on this slide that are worth noting. It's just hard when you're giving a kinship family marriage system lecture to only talk about a few terms when there's so many variations. I don't want to lead you to think that there's only a few versions of this postmarital residence, when in fact there's many, but the ones that are most pertinent for the discussions we're having these days about the Gwembe Tonga are just a few. So another important part of understanding marriage systems and the creation of family is looking at where people live once they do marry. In anthropology, we've learned that what is called postmarital residence, these patterns are important because they highlight relationships between the married couple and the families, what are called natal families, the families where they were born. So societies have rules concerning where the newly married couple should live. So just like rules about who you can and can't marry and rules about how many spouses you can have, there are also rules about where you should live once you do marry. In America, of course, the ideal is that a newly married couple sets up their own household. That's the ideal. And the term that anthropologists use for this practice when a couple forms an independent household is called neo-local residence, neo being new, a new household. So a newly married couple sets up a new separate household. One thing to think about with all of these rules, whether it's the who you do and don't marry and your multiple spouses or not, and then residence patterns, is that these are rules in as much as breaking them carries some kind of consequences or sanctions. So when a newly married couple in the United States doesn't set up their own household, it's usually explained as economic hardship. So the reality is explained by certain factors. Or so in the United States, if they don't set up a new household, it's explained as economic factors or perhaps the couple's status as students, and that the sanction is that people, outsiders, will look at that newly married couple and kind of see them not as independent, that there's a little bit of critique about their status, and they're kind of still considered children if they haven't established their new household. So by living with parents in the United States, they kind of don't obtain the status of adults, right? I'm sure you're kind of familiar with that, or it's explained away to try to help them get away with it without losing status. So generally, Americans believe that couples should not get married unless they are mature and economically independent and able to set up their own household. That's the norm. But many cultures around the world actually don't have that kind of belief system and believe that, in fact, newly married families remain part of their natal families. Newly married families should be tied to their extended family, and the postmarital residence patterns do ensure that newly married couples do maintain relationships. So all this long list here is different patterns. So the virilocal or patrilocal residence is where the wife is incorporated into the household of her husband's relatives, since she leaves the family where she was raised. So the new couple goes to live with the husband's parents. And this is practiced in many places throughout Africa, and especially in the patrilineal societies. So cattle herding societies like the Maasai and the Arial will incorporate a new bride into the husband's family, and that's done partly through the marital residence following the marriage. Matrilocal or uxorilocal residence is where the husband is incorporated in the wife's family. And in fact, this kind of residence pattern does, the incorporation doesn't run that deep typically in the societies that practice this. The husband is supposedly incorporated into the wife's family by living with her parents upon marriage to their daughter, but in fact the wife can actually divorce the husband fairly easily. Divorce is a very easy option in societies that practice this kind of residence pattern, and they are typically matrilineal societies that practice matrilocal residence. However, the Gwembe Tonga do not practice matrilocal residence, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But an example of matrilocal residence is in the U.S. Southwest with Pueblo societies in Arizona and New Mexico. Another pattern of postmarital residence is avunculocal residence. Avunculocal. And the way I remember this term is the word uncle is kind of in there, avunculocal. Avunculocal residence is when the newly married couple lives with the groom's mother's brother rather than with the father of the groom. This form of residence occurs among the Gwembe Tonga. In fact, when the Gwembe Tonga do practice formal rules of postmarital residence, they tend to follow the avunculocal residence pattern, where a newly married couple will go live with the groom's mother's brother. And remember, matrilineal society, the mother's brother is an important person, and in the next lectures we'll go into more detail into the matrilineal or patrilineal. So avunculocal residence is an important residence pattern for our case study on the Gwembe Tonga. And two other kinds of residence patterns are the bilocal residence or duolocal residence. And bilocal residence is the idea that after marriage, the couple can live either with the bride's family or with the groom's family, but they cannot establish an independent household. So they can choose between the bride's family or the groom's family, but they must reside with one. They can't just form an independent household. And the instances of this kind of residence is widespread, but it also varies in that the the bride and groom can live with the bride's family for a little while and then go back to the groom's family. Now, dual local residence is a practice found in Africa. In Ghana in particular is a famous case of dual local residence. So this postmarital residence rule is that a husband and wife live with their respective kin group apart from each other. So the new couple does not actually live together. The wife remains living with her family, her natal family, and the husband remains living with his natal family. This is dual local residence. So the Ashanti of Ghana, who traditionally lived in pretty large towns, have this form of postmarital residence. The husbands and wives live in the same town, but not in the same household. And in the evenings, there's, the ethnographic stories about this kind of marriage system describe ethnographically how in the evenings you see young children carrying an evening meal from the wife to the husband's house, and the husband is living with his father. So the wife is sending meals over to her husband and her husband's father's, the family of her husband. So that's a kind of residence pattern that is found. I'm not actually sure how widely it's practiced these days, but it's a historically famous example of dual local residence. And it's worth noting here that the Ghanaian case of the Ashanti actually are famous for their household decision making as well, such that when a couple marries, men and women keep all of their resources separate, and men and women have separate bank accounts. And that when Ashanti women heard about Americans, husbands and wives having joint bank accounts and pooling their resources, the Ashanti women thought that American women were crazy to risk pooling their resources with their husband, and it was a completely foreign idea to them to join resources that way. So just an example of how these rules really shape worldview, and that the worldview you live in makes other people's worlds seem bizarre, so that our American pattern of pooling resources and having joint bank accounts in our marriages seems completely bizarre to another ethnic group around the world. Okay, and in the final lecture, I will talk about the lineage and descent systems.